In the previous video, we talked about how to find the profit maximizing quantity and then price for a monopolist. So we know in general, marginal revenue equals marginal cost gives us the profit maximizing quantity. Here, if we have a market demand given in slope-intercept form and a total cost equation, we can find marginal revenue one of two ways. We can find total revenue and take the derivative, or we know it has the same intercept, twice the slope, as market demand. So there's marginal revenue in the monopolized market, and marginal cost is the derivative of total cost with respect to Q. Okay, so here, 0 minus 5 plus 2Q to the 1 power. MC equals MR gives us our profit maximizing quantity. Then we can plug it back into demand to find the profit maximizing price. Finally, profit, price times quantity. That gives us our total revenue minus the total costs of producing Q equals 10. So in this video, we're going to talk for the first time about efficiency of markets. We say that the perfectly competitive market is economically efficient and that the monopolized market is not economically efficient. So let's see why. Returning to the perfectly competitive market, we have this downward sloping demand, which is for the entire market equal to marginal revenue. And then we've got market supply, which is the sum of all the individual quantities in the market, right? Going back to chapter 2, 3 in there, we know that equilibrium is the price such that supply equals demand, or quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. So that's right here. And then we can find consumer surplus. Here's the line of price. Consumer surplus is all the area above price, but below demand. So remember, demand reflects willingness to pay. What this is saying is some consumer would have been willing to pay this price, say, but only had to pay the market price. So that's consumer surplus. Another consumer would have been willing to pay this price, but only had to pay this price. So that's surplus, and so on. All of these are consumers that would have been willing to pay a higher price, but don't have to. And likewise for suppliers, here's our market supply. Some suppliers would have been willing to charge this low price, but get to charge the market price. So that's producer surplus, and so on. Right, what we can see here is that this entire area in between the two curves is filled in by consumer and producer surplus. It's relatively equally split, but that doesn't have to be the case. Depending on what 202 class you took, you might have talked about the impact of elasticity on surplus. We'll go back and mention that in chapter 9 when we talk about the role of government. But what we can say is that even if the surpluses are not divided up equally, right, even if producer surplus was bigger than producer surplus, it's still true that this entire area is filled in with total surplus, consumer plus producer. All right, there's no what we call deadweight loss or wasted surplus. Let's see what happens in the monopolized market. All right, so for the monopolist, we have this demand curve, and then we have a marginal revenue curve, which is twice as steep as demand. So to contrast, for the perfect competitor, demand equals marginal revenue, and that's not the case for the monopolist. In the last video, we proved why. So what does the monopolist do? They set marginal cost equal marginal revenue. That's this quantity right here. And then they choose the price, which is the maximum willingness to pay on the demand curve for that quantity, right? So for the monopolist produces this quantity right here and charges this price. And we can see that we can compute our area of consumer surplus. Looks like it's pretty much definitely smaller. And that makes sense, right? Because the monopolist is producing a lower quantity and charging a higher price. Not so good for consumers. Right. Producer surplus has potentially increased, but right, in general, it's below market price. There's market price out to quantity. Now we have this area of blank space that was formerly filled in with surplus. The reason for this, what we call deadweight loss, is that the monopolist is producing a lower quantity than what we call the efficient or optimal quantity. Right, and we could calculate this area of deadweight loss. We could just apply our area of a triangle formula. Some previous assignments and quizzes and stuff have asked about that. It's more important for me that you just be able to understand what these points are. So B and C are referring to the monopolist. MC equals MR gives us our quantity, and then the monopolist chooses the price that meets demand at that quantity. It turns out we can actually see what the perfect competitor would have been doing if this was a perfectly competitive market rather than monopolized. We can see that the perfect competitor is essentially choosing MC equals D and D equals MR. So the perfect competitor was choosing this point here, which had a lower price and a higher quantity than the monopolist. Right, so this area of this triangle, ABC, is given by, is created by the fact that the monopolist chooses a lower quantity than the efficient market quantity. All right, so I have some math examples here of calculating consumer surplus in the consumer market, consumer surplus in the consumer surplus in the competitive market, and then consumer surplus in the monopolized market. To make this video short, I'm not going to go through the math examples in this one, but let me know if you have any questions on that. Again, we're just applying the triangle formula for the area of the consumer surplus. We could also calculate some producer surplus, but it's a little bit more complicated because we don't have a very straightforward formula for the area of this kind of shape. We might have to break it into chunks or something, or use a different math formula, which we aren't going to address here. But the main point is that in the monopolized market, consumer surplus decreases. And so what we're going to do is calculate how big is that decrease in consumer surplus. And then ultimately looking ahead, we might find a potential role for government, right? If we have a market that's been monopolized and it really cuts into the consumer surplus, and for maybe a product that's a necessity, or we'll see different cases, there could be a role for the government to step in and use some different market mechanisms, market corrections. All right, one last topic. This is just a definition issue. I'm not going to do any calculation from Chapter 11. Chapter 11 talks about price discriminating monopolies, and I'm just going to define the 3 types of price discrimination. The first type of price discrimination is first degree or perfect price discrimination. In perfect price discrimination, the monopolist knows each consumer's maximum willingness to pay, so it can charge each consumer exactly that price. So if we look back up here at our monopoly graph, right, we have this area of consumer surplus because the monopolist is choosing this price here. Well, suppose the monopolist didn't choose this price. Suppose that instead it knew what each consumer was willing to pay and charged each consumer exactly that. Then the monopolist takes this entire area of surplus, right? Consumer surplus is 0, producer surplus is this whole area. This person is willing to pay this price, so the monopolist charges it, captures that surplus. It's pretty rare in reality for that to happen because the monopolist doesn't really have a good way of knowing generally what is each individual's max willingness to pay unless they had some way of conducting a survey or asking their customers like, hey, what's the most you'll pay? The closest I think we find usually is sort of like a sealed bid auction system where a bunch of people put bids in. Sometimes they do it for like hunting permits, and then the top 5 or 10 or however many bidders, the highest bidders all get the permit. So that's one way that we might see first degree price discrimination, but usually it doesn't happen. Second degree is block pricing. So consumers might have different willingness to pay for different quantities. This is sort of like the Costco or Sam's Club idea. And then third degree is differential pricing. Like if you go to an amusement park, you see different prices for, say, seniors and children and regular adults. They might have different prices on different days, and these might be aimed at getting different groups in the door or capturing some more surplus in some different way. Okay, so again, we're not going to do mathematical or graphical examples of these 3 types of price discrimination. I have posted the notes, so if that stuff is interesting to you, feel free to take a look. This will just show up as some sort of definition question in quizzes and exams. Okay, let me know if you have any questions.